Okay, well, let's jump right into where we left off last time we met. Um, oh, before I do that, let me just remind you guys. Last time we talked about enrolling the enrollment process online, so I want to remind you to do that for this module. So I think one or two of you have, but if you could make sure to take care of that this week, that would be really helpful. So we're trying to get all the students enrolled for the class. So to do that now, we're not waiting until we actually meet together in person, since we are meeting online now. So the class, is started technically for this semester. So if you could please do that. I haven't. I put the link to the form on your notes last week. I think I posted it on our group message, but I can do that again with instructions. So please take care of that. Only take you about 10 minutes, I think, to do it if you have internet signal. Okay. So that's a commercial. So remember to do that. All right. And oops, that's not what I wanted. There it is. Okay. So we are just giving our attention right now to looking at some of the key assignments that you need to get done for Module 4. And last week, we turned our attention to our favorite topic in the class. I know everybody loves it. It's your favorite one by far, is the diagram, block diagram. So we spent some time last week just sort of reviewing that a little bit. And the first 4 steps we've already covered together in the Zoom sessions. And I've got the session numbers here. I put that in your notes just for reference. So when you're working on these particular assignments, you can look at the video if you want a little extra help. And then last week, we started giving attention to diagramming. And as I mentioned, with the prophetic books, diagramming will depend on the kind of passage, the nature of the passage that you're studying. So if the passage that you're studying is more kind of like a narrative, maybe a vision or something like that, diagramming won't be as helpful, because like we saw for narratives, you remember with narratives, diagramming is only helpful for like those parts of the narrative that are instructional, maybe a sermon or a statement by one of the characters. So if you have in prophetic genre, if your passage is more of a narrative kind of passage, a dialogue, or just describing a vision or some particular event, then the diagramming won't be as helpful. But there are many parts of the prophetic books where it's a sermon. As we talked about with these prophets, right? Their primary role was to preach. They were preachers. And so if you're, if you have a passage in the prophetic book that is basically they're preaching, they're presenting a message, then that's going to be more instructional and will be helpful to diagram that part. So you just have to sort of use your judgment as you look at your text. And that's why prophecy is a little more challenging. You have to use your judgment when you look at a passage and see, okay, is this mostly kind of like a narrative type of passage? Then diagramming may not be as helpful, and maybe 1 or 2 verses might help. Or is this a sermon that's being given? Or even if it's poetic, again, remember, poetry is still also instructional. It's just doing it in a more figurative way. So for your passages in Zechariah and Revelation, your assigned passages are going to be more like a vision. So you're not going to really have much of the passage that you need to diagram. I put in the assignment, I actually indicate which verses from your passage to diagram. So you don't have to diagram the whole thing, just certain parts of it. And I put those particular verses in your notes in the assignment as a guide. Maybe I can I guess I could just show that to you right now since we're talking about it. So that is assignment 4.13, I believe. And here we'll just look at it together briefly. So this is the assignment, give you the example. Actually, it's the example we're going to go through the rest of the example today in Obadiah. But then after the example, I give you space for you to do the diagram. And notice here, I indicate for the assigned passage what verses you need to diagram. So if your assigned passage is Zechariah 2, you don't need to diagram all 13 verses, just do verses 7 to 13. If your passage is Zechariah 3, then just diagram verses 7 to 10, okay? So I just tell you directly what passage to do the diagram for, okay? Just to give you some guidance there. And then for the textual observations, you only have to do the observations for the part of the passage that you diagram. So you don't have to do observations for the whole thing. Just focus on, so if you were Zechariah chapter 3, then if that's your assigned passage, then you only need to diagram verses 7 to 10, and then you only need to do the textual observations for verses 7 to 10. Okay? You don't have to do the whole chapter. You can if you want, but you don't have to for the assignment. Okay? And then after that, I ask you to do word study. That's part of this. And that will be for the whole passage. So if Zechariah 3 is your assigned passage, then you'll just look for at least 5 significant words from Zechariah 3. All right, from the whole passage. Okay. So that's the assignment there. Any questions on that?
Pastor Tim.
Yeah.
I think assignment, the read and observe the book. The number 2 says observe, make observations from the book overall. That's why I was doing that.
Yes.
The whole book.
Yes.
Is that it?
And I give you some here. Yeah, that's a good question. This is what you're talking about, right? Make observations from the book overall. That is the whole book. Yes. And I just ask you to do 5 observations from each chapter and ask 2 questions. Okay?
Okay.
So first, just make some specific observations. So just try to answer these questions from the whole book. And then make general observations. That is, just go through each chapter and just make 5 observations and ask at least 2 questions from each chapter. So for Zechariah, that is, there's 14 chapters. Okay.
Okay, thanks.
All right, good. Any other questions?
.14, I think. It is too hard, sir.
Sorry, your voice is a little faint. Can you say that a little louder? I couldn't hear you.
I think 4.14.
Oh, okay, sure.
It is too hard, sir.
4.14. All right. That is what we call the primary matters, but basically that's the resources. This one?
No, 4.13, because there is the first part is in Zechariah chapter 2 verse 1 to 6. There is a dialogue, sir, in a partly narrative.
Right.
That one. Oh, there is dialogue. What we can do for that dialogue?
For assignment 4.13?
Yep.
Yeah.
If I am assigned in Zechariah chapter 2 verse 1 to 13.
Yes.
The other part, verse 1 to 6, I interpret it as a narrative. Then there is a portion, I think dialogue, there is a dialogue. Then
Yes,
how could you do that?
you
Not
don't need,
included in diagramming.
no, you don't need to diagram that. That's why I pointed out here. For that passage, if you have
That's
Zechariah chapter 2, just diagram the last verses 7 to 13.
because there is a portion, sir. That's why I am confused. Because if it is narrative, we are going to interpret in a, I mean, we identify the protagonist like that.
Oh, for no, for the,
Narrative.
yeah, but it's not, we were
Because
talking about this.
there is a question in that assignment that we should identify the setting, the character. What do you mean for that, sir?
Yeah,
Identify
that's
the
for
setting.
assignment 4.12, right?
4.12.
Yeah, this one, right? So for this assignment, 4.12, the prophetic passage analysis. I think
Oh,
that's
and
what you're
if
asking.
narrative, this one, sir. Step 2.
Yeah.
If narrative, complete the setting, character, scene, and plot analysis. That's why I'm stuck with that.
Yeah, notice though these words, if necessary,
Okay.
because this is why I said you have to use some judgment here because it may have narrative features. Notice I say this here. The passage may have narrative features, but not be a story with a plot.
Thank you.
Okay. So these visions in Zechariah are not stories with a plot. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Like in John, when you did your sermons from John or Jonah or Ruth, those were a story with a plot. But in prophetic books, sometimes there is a story, a narrative within the book. But oftentimes, like with these visions, it just has narrative features. So you have characters, you have a setting, there may be a scene or two, all right, but not a plot. You remember, a plot is the author is telling a story that has a particular point from the story. A vision does have a point, but it's not, you don't find that point by looking at it like a story. You find the point actually by usually the angel explains what the point of the vision is. So all you need to do for that part and that assignment is just note who are the key characters in this vision and what is the setting of the vision, and is there more than one scene in the vision? So what does the narrator say? What do each of the characters say? That seems important. All right. But you won't have to do a whole plot analysis and find a problem and the rising action, falling action. For those visions, you don't have to do that.
We identify the narrator.
Yeah. So just identify. So you'll do like the setting analysis, right? So what's the setting of the vision? All right. Like when is it happening? Where does it happen? Like your vision in Zechariah 2 is around Jerusalem, right? In the future, right? That's the setting. Now the characters are who's in the vision? Who's part of the vision? Okay. So Zechariah, of course, would be one, and then perhaps an angel messenger. There may be others. Zechariah 3 in the vision, you have you have Satan and Joshua in that vision. So you just want to identify who are the key characters in the vision, So there won't be a protagonist and an antagonist in this case, because it's not like a normal story. Does this make sense? You have narratives that are stories, actual stories where all the scenes together form a plot that, so there's a problem, there's rising action, there's a climax, then there's a point to the story. But then there are those parts of scripture that are just have certain narrative features, but it's not like a full regular story. And that's the case in these visions in Zechariah and in Revelation. So what you need to do is just at least to be able to look at these visions and understand, okay, what seems to be, so you want to do character analysis. That is, who are the characters and what seems to be the important dialogue? What does the narrator say that seems important? What is the setting of this particular vision? So you're just going to identify the narrative features of the vision, but you're not going to be doing all the narrative analysis for that. It's the same with the poetry part, right? In that assignment, I also say identify if there's poetic, examine parallelism if used, identify the imagery and figurative language. But for in prophetic literature, it's not like a psalm, so you won't have all the poetic devices, right? You won't have certain things like that, but you will have some poetic features like imagery or figurative language. You likely will not see parallelism, but you might see a little bit. Sometimes there is there. So you just look through and see, okay, do I see any parallelism here? Now in these visions, I don't think there is any in Zechariah. Okay, so you probably won't have any parallelism there. But there are some images and there are some figurative language there, like metaphor, things like that. All right. So it's kind of you don't do the full analysis like we would do if you were studying a psalm. Okay. You don't go through every step, but you just look for the key things that we know is typically in poetry: imagery, poetic devices, sometimes parallelism. And the same with there may be narrative features. You may have dialogue there. Okay, so what seems to be some of the important statements by the characters? What does the narrator say that seems important? What is the setting of this particular? Is there more than one scene to this vision? I think most of the visions are one scene, but a couple of them might have two scenes.
Okay.
So this is a little more difficult because you have to use your experience from the previous modules to help you when you study these, but you don't do the same full analysis like you would do for a narrative or for a poem. And you can look at the example again. I give you an example from Obadiah. All right, maybe I should just show that to you. Okay, here's the assignment 412. So first we have read the passage, make observations. So I did that. And then step 2, genre. Obadiah is a sermon that uses poetic language. Okay, so I noticed that. I analyzed, determine, okay, what's the genre here? Thus, we must do poetic analysis on the passage. This includes the imagery, parallelism, poetic devices. So I just look through the passage for imagery, and I see that some images there in the passage. Then I look to see if there's any parallelism, and in this case, there was in Obadiah. All right? Because it was a sermon using poetic devices, Obadiah did seem to use parallelism. Now in the Zechariah visions, I don't think you're going to see this, but in Obadiah, I did. So I noted it in this step 2. And these are the parallelism. Then I looked for poetic devices. I looked for the figurative language, and there was some in Obadiah in verses 15 to 21 that I studied. Then the other poetic devices, refrain, repetition, apostrophe, interjection, and I just look for those things. Now, Obadiah did not really have any narrative features. Okay, the style of Obadiah was just one sermon that Obadiah preached condemning Edom, right? And so there wasn't any dialogue, there wasn't any narrative features like different characters. It's because it was just Obadiah proclaiming the message he received from the Lord. Okay? But in Zechariah, you've got these visions that Zechariah was given, and as he describes these visions, they're described like kind of like in a narrative way, with characters, dialogue, narrator comments, and such. So this is why prophecy is module 4, because you have to rely on your experience from what you learned from the other modules to look at your passage and decide, okay, what kinds of things should I see here? Okay, I see some narrative features, so I want to note that. I see some poetic features, so I want to look for what those poetic features are. Oh, this is a sermon, so it's going to be broken into, it's going to be direct instruction. So there's going to be paragraphs, like in an epistle, because this is direct instruction. Here's a prophecy about a future event. Okay, I need to look for symbols there. I need to look for what kind of a prophecy is it? Is it a judgment oracle? Is it a salvation oracle? Is it apocalyptic? So those steps that we looked at, the other steps for the prophetic analysis that we see here on assignment 4.12. Let's see, where are we here? Oh, why isn't this? Come on. Okay, these other steps, right? So second step is you look at your passage and see what kind of a passage is it. Is there narrative features? Are there poetic features? Is it like a sermon? Then you do the rest of these steps for the passage: the nature and the time frame, identify the type of prophetic genre. Again, that's those 3: judgment, salvation, oracle. Or then you identify what appears to be symbolic, and then how your passage fits in the author's flow of thought, and then finally, is it's cited elsewhere in Scripture. Then after all that, the next assignment is you'll diagram those parts of your passage which seem to be more direct instruction that a diagram could be helpful for. And if it's a sermon, then you're going to diagram the whole thing. Like Obadiah, if you're studying through Obadiah, you would diagram the whole thing. It's all one sermon. And so it's all direct instruction. And that's why we're going to look at that in a moment, an example from Obadiah, and go work through it for the diagram. But you see what I mean? There's kind of, at this point now, you need to have an understanding as you look at a text, is what kind of a genre features do I see in this passage? And then from what I've studied in the past on the different genres, I apply that understanding to this passage and trying to uncover trying to study this particular passage.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
Can you give me a hint, sir? There is a word in the second paragraph. He who touches you touches the apple of his eye.
Okay. On Zechariah 2.
What kind of poetic analysis.
All right, let's look at. All right, so here's your passage, Zechariah 2, right?
Yep.
So it's the vision of the man with the measuring rod, measuring cord, right?
Yes. In verse 8, for he who touches you touches the apple of his eye.
Well, first, as I look at this passage, I see that it's kind of like a narrative, right?
Yep.
There's a
Proposal, sir.
narrator, right? Zechariah is describing what he saw, and then there's dialogue. He's having dialogue with the man that had a measuring cord. And then an angel was there also. So you want to identify, so you see, there's narrative features. So you want to identify these characters. There's Zechariah. There's this man with the measuring line. There's an angel who's speaking with him, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Then next, so you understand that, and then you want to look at, okay, what other narrative features do I see here? Well, I see Zechariah is acting like the narrator, and he's giving some information, right? That he saw the man with the cord, that he also indicates there was two angels, one that was speaking to him and another that was coming to meet him. That looks like most of the narrator comments. Then you have dialogue. Okay, so what seems to be a key statements in the dialogue that you want to take note of? All right. Yes, and then you get to verse 7, and here's the message that the vision that God wants to speak through the vision. Okay, that the vision is, this is the message from the vision. Okay, so the vision is this picture of he says, I will be a wall of fire around her. Now, again, here you want to ask, okay, this is prophetic genre. There's often poetic devices that are used in the prophetic genre. And so as you look, you want to ask, okay, is he talking about being a literal wall of fire? Or is that a figure of speech? Is it a metaphor?
Yep.
So you want to ask that question. Or like you noticed in verse 8, he who touches you touches the apple of his eye, or the pupil, right? Of his eye. So does God have a pupil? Does he have an eyeball?
Yes, a big eye.
Yeah, the big eye. So this is obviously not literal, because God doesn't have an actual eyeball with a pupil in it. So this is a figure of speech. All right. To touch the apple of God's eye is a figure of speech. So you have to ask is, what is that? Is that an idiom? I would say it is. And then what is it meant to say? What is it pointing to here? Okay, so you'll have to think about that. What is this idiom? Is this apple of his eye? Is this used elsewhere? And there's a couple of passages where it is. So that might give you an idea. Notice, by the way, so I would do a word study on the word here, apple. Honestly, what is that? So, because his eye, he doesn't have an actual physical eyeball. So this is obviously a figure of speech here.
That's why, sir, I searched for the meaning of that.
Yeah. So I would look up the word for apple here, or apple of his eye, and see what, and do a word study on that phrase to see what it means. And even the word touch, what does that word touch mean? Okay, and then I would just keep going through and looking for, do I see any poetic devices in verse 9? Any figures of speech, right? So I just, he says, I will wave my hand over them. Does God have a hand? Okay, that's not literal. then, because God doesn't have a literal hand, but that expression, wave my hand over them, has a meaning, but that's a figure of speech. Okay. I don't see any other poetic devices, figures of speech now, but there is repetition, right? Yahweh of hosts, Yahweh of hosts, Yahweh, Yahweh, right? We see that a lot here. So again, you can go through that, but repetition is here, and then you can look for others. There's no Salah here, right? This isn't a psalm. But just go through the list. What figures of speech do you see? Because there is poetic language used here. What other poetic devices do you see? And you guys are all going to do this. Chapter 3, it's the same kind of thing. It's a vision here. We're given the characters. Joshua the high priest, the angel of Yahweh, and Satan are in this particular vision. And then there's dialogue. Okay. And then you just go through and say, okay, are there any poetic devices here? Anything figure of speech? Or there's, again, the whole list. Does that help, Bridio, or do you have another question? Does that make sense, Bridio? No? I can't hear you. Sorry. Is your microphone off?
Maybe microphone.
Oh, there he is. Now I can hear you.
Okay, thank you.
Did that
And
help?
also, it helps, sir.
Okay. You have another question?
And also repeated the Lord of Armies.
Yes. Yeah.
But in this translation, I can find nothing.
Yeah, it's Yahweh of hosts. So did you use the
Yeah,
ESV?
Nasby, sir.
Oh, use the NAS. Okay. Yeah. So that might translate it a little different there. Yeah. The Lord. The Lord. So it doesn't put Yahweh. The Lord of hosts. The Lord of hosts. The Lord of hosts. Okay. So see that a lot here.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. All right. Anybody else have a question from that or from your passage? Okay. Well, let's keep going. Hopefully that helped a little bit. Again, look at the example I put in the notes or put in the assignments. I think that'll also help you a little bit to know what to do as well, give you an idea. But just do your best. Just try try it. Even if some stuff doesn't make sense to you, if you're not clear, you can ask me about it, or just do your best. Just want you to work through these assignments because I think it'll help you, force you to think about certain things and then apply what you've learned from the previous modules that we've done. Okay. So after doing that prophetic analysis of the passage that we were just talking about, Following that is then doing the diagram, again, of certain parts of your passage, as we discussed. All right, those parts of the text which are maybe instructional or like a sermon or direct. Okay. So what I wanted to do was just, we had started doing an example from Obadiah on the diagram from Obadiah, verses 10 to 12, I think. So I just wanted to go back to that and have us go through the remaining steps. We did the first step, which was identify the first independent clause in the sentence, okay? You don't have to find all of them, but just see if you can find the first one, and it's usually near the beginning. And then after that, identify all the rest of the phrases and clauses in the sentence by, again, looking for the connector words, of course, and punctuation can also be a helpful tool. And then you want to state how each phrase and clause functions in the sentence. And that's the step that we left off at last time we got together. And just remember, as you're doing this, there's really two kinds of modifying. The phrase or clause will modify in one of two ways. It will modify either a verb or a noun. All right, this will always be the case. The phrase or clause, that each phrase or clause within the passage will be modifying either a verb or a noun. How do you know which one? Well, that's where you have to ask yourself, okay, what question does this phrase or clause answer? Is it giving me a why, a place, a purpose, a location, a reason, a how? Then it's going to modify a verb. Those typically modify an action. But if it's telling me who, or what kind, or which one, then it's going to likely modify a noun. All right, and we'll see examples of that. And then once you've done this third step, which is really the hardest because you're trying to figure out where each phrase and clause fits, then the last step is simply to put the independent clause to the left, and then all the remaining phrases and clauses will go under the word that they modify. Okay? So last week when we met, we figured out the first independent clause in the sentence. Actually, we saw the first two, and that was you will be covered and you will be cut off forever. Okay? We realized those were the both independent clauses, and we said they both were because they were linked together by this conjunction and. Okay. Then the second step was we broke down we identified the rest of the phrases and clauses, and I think I've got it. Yeah. So we did it by the blue is the conjunctions, yellow is the prepositions, and then the gray is the relative pronouns. So we then broke this down into each phrase and clause from that, right? Where we just went, okay, we just did it this way. And then sometimes we noticed the punctuation also would help. So here, you will be covered. We saw the comma here, so we realized, okay, looks like there's a break there. And so we just went through, and that's what this is, all right? We went through and identified every phrase and clause and determined what it was, if it's a phrase, an independent clause, or a dependent clause. Okay? All right, so that's what we did last week. What I'd like us to do this week, we'll do the next three steps, but what I'd like to do first is just ask if Pastor Allen, if you could read verses 10 to 12 from Obadiah, just to get us familiar again with the passage.
Okay, verse 10 to 12. Because of violence to your brother Jacob, you will be covered with shame, and you will be cut off forever. On the day that you stood aloof, on the day that strangers carried off his wealth, and foreigners entered his gate, and cast lots for Jerusalem, you too were as one of them. Do not gloat over your brother's day, the day of his misfortune. And do not rejoice over the sons of Judah in the day of their destruction. Yes, do not boast in the day of their distress.
All right, great. Okay, so from again, we identified the independent clause and then the phrases and clauses. So what I'd like to do now is go through and identify, okay, how do each of these phrases and clauses work? How are they functioning in this passage? What did they modify and how? How do they modify it? Okay. And maybe what I'll do is let's do this. On the side. All right. And okay. So again, this part is the more challenging part because now you're trying to think about, okay, how is this functioning? How is this working in the sentence? Actually, I should have done this. Sorry, give me a second. I'm trying to rearrange. Okay, there we go. All right. So as we look at this first, because of violence, okay? Now, we noted that's a phrase. It's not an independent clause, right? The independent clause is you will be covered and you will be cut off forever, okay? So we know that because of violence, it's a phrase. So again, remember this rule that phrases always modify something else, okay? And dependent clauses always modify something else. The only thing that doesn't modify something else is an independent clause, okay? Because that's why we put it on the diagram. We stick it over to the left because it's not modifying anything else. But every phrase or dependent clause is modifying something else. So as we look at this passage and we've already determined, okay, because of violence, that's a phrase. There's no verb here. So this has to be modifying something else. But the question is, what does it modify? Right? If this is a phrase here, because of violence, to your brother Jacob, because of violence must modify something else. And in this case, it's something after it. So I'll start with you, Alan, and just ask, what do you think it could be modifying here? And you're muted, by the way. So
The first phrase, because of violence, what does it modify? I think the next phrase.
okay,
Your
what
brother
word?
Jacob.
Okay, so what? First, we want to ask, okay, because of violence. So what kind of question do you think that's answering? Is that giving us a location? Is it giving us a when or a why?
Why?
Yeah, that word because of, right? That's telling us
Yes.
why. Because of violence. Okay. So that gives me a clue then. It's okay. So if it's answering the question why, remember we just said up here that if it answers the question why, then it's going to be modifying a verb. Okay. So if that's the case, I look back over here to the right. Because of violence, I'm going to look for what verb could it be modifying? What verb could it be telling us why? What do you think?
Violence.
Okay, because of violence. Violence is a noun. That's part of this phrase.
Yes, it's a noun. That's why I was really asking in my mind. It's not a verb anymore. It's a noun, but something was done to Jacob.
Yes, something was done to Jacob. And so notice he says, you will be covered with shame. And I think because of violence is saying why you will be covered with shame.
Yeah.
See that the action here, you will be covered, speaking to Edom, right? Why will you be covered with shame? Because of violence. Does that make sense at all? This is a little bit tough, this one, because of the way it's constructed here. But I would say this then. Sorry. Okay. This phrase, I would say, modifies will be covered, telling why. Why will Jacob be covered with shame? Because of your violence. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Because of violence isn't describing Jacob. It's not just it, but it is telling us why they will be covered with shame and why they will be cut off forever. So technically, it modifies both of these clauses. It might make a little more sense once I actually do the diagram here, because sometimes it might be hard to see where a particular phrase or clause goes. What about that next, that to your brother Jacob? I think it's describing what kind of violence, the violence on or to your brother Jacob, that violence. So I think it's modifying. It's not saying where they will be covered. I think it's describing what kind of violence, the violence to your brother Jacob, that violence. So I would say this second phrase, because there's no verb, modifies violence, telling what kind. The violence to your brother Jacob, that kind, that violence. Okay. Then we identified you will be covered as independent clause. Now, then we had this next phrase, with shame. Okay, with, right, is a connector word. It's a phrase. Let me ask Kazot about this one. Where do you think with shame goes? What is it modifying, you think, Kazot?
Covered.
Okay. And how? How do you think it's modifying it?
Covered with shame. Under with covered will be covered under the uh independent clause.
Yes. Yeah, it's modifying that verb covered. And I think it's the way it's modifying is telling us how. How will you be
Oh,
covered?
yeah.
With shame.
The same.
Okay. And then the next we have another independent clause. Okay, how about Kazot? How about the again, this is a on the day. All right, that's the next phrase here that we identified. Where does that go? What do you think that's modifying?
It will be covered with shame.
Maybe first ask, what kind of question is it answering?
When?
Yeah, it's answering when, right? So it's telling when. And if it's telling us when something's happening, is that going to modify a verb or a noun? Remember our here, I should probably do this.
Noun.
Let me put it over here. Okay.
A verb.
Yes. The verb, right?
It's modifying the clause. You will be cut off forever.
Okay. Well, let's think about it a minute. It's going to modify a verb. Then the question is which verb? So we have two verbs in front of it, or above it, will be covered and will be cut off, right? Those are both verbs. The question is that what he's referring to? You will be cut off forever on the day. Is that when they'll be cut off? Or if we read the rest of the verse, is he saying, is this day that they stood aloof, is that something that's going to happen in the future, or that's something that happened in the past?
In the past.
Yes.
On the day that.
So if it's saying when, if it's talking about something in the past, then does it make sense it be modifying a verb that's in the future? Is he saying you will be covered in the future in the past on the day you stood aloof? That doesn't make sense, does it?
Yes. I
So
think that because of the praise is the nearest pastor team,
yeah,
the independent clause that is nearest to him to on that day.
yeah, that's why this is a little more tricky. The way that Obadiah is doing this, he's actually like here, remember, he had two phrases up in front of the clause that it modified, and he's doing the same thing in verse 11. Actually, all of this modifies this independent clause. Really, he could have said it this way. You two were as one of them on the day that you stood aloof, on the day that strangers, okay? But that's really what he's doing here. But he put the main sentence at the end of the verse, not at the beginning. So he made this a little more complicated.
Very tricky, Pastor Tim.
Yeah, this is tricky. And this is a poetic style, really.
He could have stated it simply,
yes,
but it's so complicated.
Yeah, and oh yeah, Brio.
A question, sir.
Yeah. Yeah, oh, you got muted there.
Correct me if I'm wrong. The verse 10, sir, is present tense. The word will be and will be. Then in verse 11, I think using a past tense, then going back to the principle of proximity, where during diagramming, sir, where did we place that? Because past tense and present tense.
I'm sorry. Can you ask that question again? I don't think I understood. So you're saying
Verse 10,
verse
verse
10 is the
10 and
future.
future, sir. Then the
Correct.
other one is past tense.
Yes. So you wouldn't have past tense with the future, but notice here at the end of verse 11 is the verb here. What's the verb here in verse 11 at the end in this clause? You two are as one of them. What's the verb?
I think, sir, present, sir. Correct me if.
Well, first tell me what the verb is here. You two were as one of them. What's
I
the
think
verb there?
the word is past, sir.
What is the verb though?
Past, I think, sir, past tense.
It's past tense, but tell me what the verb is in this. Which word here is the verb?
Where, sir? Where?
Yeah. Okay, sorry, I didn't hear
Meaning,
that. And it's past tense, you're right.
yep.
So what makes sense if these are past tense, right? Stood is a past tense verb, carried, past tense, entered, past tense, cast, past tense. So what would it make sense then that it would go with verse 10 and the future tense, or the end of verse 11, the past tense verb? You see that? Makes sense? And yeah, Alan, you're right. He did make it more complicated here by he didn't put the main sentence, the independent clause at the beginning, right? He could have done it this way. You were as one of them. When? On the day you stood aloof. When? On the day strangers carried off his wealth. When on the day foreigners entered his gate. It would have been a lot easier to understand if he did it that way, but instead he waited until the end of the verse to give the main sentence or the independent clause. Why do you think he did that?
To give emphasis.
I think so. I think you're exactly right. Sometimes, right, biblical authors will move, if they want to emphasize a certain idea or thought, they will move it towards the beginning of the verse. In fact, in Greek, that's very common, that the first word in the sentence in Greek often is put there for emphasis. So if you were studying a passage in Greek and like they put the verb or an odd word at the beginning of the sentence that doesn't follow a normal pattern, then they're doing that because they want to emphasize it. And I think that's happening in verse 11 here and in verse 10, because he could have said, you will be covered with shame because of violence to your brother Jacob, right? Wouldn't this have made more sense to have it in this order? To make the main sentence first, you will be covered with shame, and then give the reason after that. But he didn't do that, did he? He put the reason at the beginning of the verse. I think, again, he's emphasizing it. So both verse 10 and 11, it seems like he's bringing the modifying phrases forward because he wants to emphasize them. Any questions on that? So yeah, this is a little tricky because now you see that the modifying, actually this phrase on the day, all right, that you stood aloof is actually modifying something later, not something before. Usually we look for something that was just said. So normally we'd say, oh, on the day, okay, it must go with this sentence or this one, right? That's how we normally think. But in this case, on the day you stood aloof is modifying something later in the verse. So this does make it more of a challenge because you then have to try to figure out, well, what are some clues that will tell me where it goes? Well, as Brilio pointed out, verse 10 is future tense, the verbs are. But in verse 11, all the verbs are past tense. Okay, so it would make sense more that these in verse 11 aren't going to modify the future verbs, but they're going to be connected to past tense verb.
So diagramming, Pastor Tim, really helps to see the important clauses.
The what helps to see important clauses?
Diagramming will really help to notice, or we can see the important clauses or phrases.
Yeah, it forces us to do that. So here, I'll just show you the diagram just for the sake of time. All right. So verse 10, we talked about you will be covered and you will be cut off. Those are the independent clauses, right? So they're on the far left. And then we determine because of violence is telling us why you will be covered. So I indented it. Let's see. In this case, right, it's indented and it's modifying that verb, will be covered. And then I put to your brother Jacob, that's describing the violence. What kind of violence? Which violence? All right. And then with shame was telling us how you will be covered. So I put it underneath, will be covered. And then when we get to verse 11, and then forever is actually modifies how long they'll be cut off, right? When. And then verse 11, notice on the day, which day? The day that you stood aloof. On the day, which day? The day that strangers carried off his wealth. On the day foreigners entered his gate. On the day, oh, this should be like this. Right? All of this is modifying were because it's telling when you were as one of them. You follow me? Let's go through this. Okay. Oops. Okay, on the day. So that's describing a time when something's happening. So I know it's going to modify a verb. All right. And I know that the verb it modifies is it's not when they will be cut off, because it's saying on the day that you stood, past tense, aloof. Okay. So I don't think it's going up to the verb above. It's going to modify something later, but I have to wait for it. So let's keep going. On the day that you stood aloof. Okay, this is describing which day. Right? Which day? What day? The day that you stood aloof. And then he repeats, on the day. So it's the same time, but he's going to describe something else. On the day that strangers carried off his wealth. Okay, his is speaking of Jacob there, Jerusalem. So again, he repeats, on the day, which day? The day that strangers carried off his wealth. And then notice, and foreigners entered his gate. Okay, that word and, remember, it connects two grammatically equal ideas. And in this case, it's connecting strangers carried off his wealth with foreigners entered his gate. Technically, we could line it up like this. Okay, two things. On the day that strangers carried off his wealth, and on the day that foreigners entered his gate. And then notice he adds another, he says, cast lots for Jerusalem. All right, now this is the same subject here for both verbs, entered and cast. And that's why I diagrammed it this way. Okay. Strangers carried off his wealth, foreigners entered his gate, foreigners cast lots for Jerusalem. All three of these, notice again, we have and here, and is connecting, entered his gate with cast lots for Jerusalem. They both are sharing the same subject, but he doesn't repeat foreigners in that next line, but it's assumed that it's the same subject. So notice there's three basically modifiers of the day. Which day? The day that strangers carried off his wealth. First, second, the day that foreigners entered his gate. Third, the day that foreigners cast lots for Jerusalem. And then he gives us the independent clause. You too were as one of them on the day that all this happened. Okay. Questions on that? I know this one's pretty challenging here, but did that make sense? Or if not, please ask questions. I can explain it again. Or does it make no sense at all?
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
Verse 11, sir. If we try to rearrange the phrasing, sir, or the arrangement, where you two were one, you two were as one of them, then we place that in first line.
You can do that if you want. Like do this, you mean?
Yep. So that it is easier to see, sir.
You can do that. I should probably. That's perfectly fine to do. I usually don't rearrange the verses because sometimes I might accidentally remove a word, like erase it by accident, or I like to have my diagram follow the way the translation reads. So I usually don't do that. But if it's easier for you to see the structure, to do it this way, that's perfectly fine. As long as you don't leave any text out. Okay.
Because it is easier to make an outline, sir, if we place like that.
Yes, you're right. And you could do that in verse 10 as well. Okay. You could put this above because those are the main ideas. So now we can see the three main clauses. But yeah, in verse 10, you could do this. You will be covered, you will be cut off, and then have because like that. So yeah, that's easier to see what's happening. That's perfectly fine to do. I don't do it because in the past when I have done it, I've accidentally deleted words or phrases. But if you're careful, you know that this can be easier for you to see the outline of your passage more easily. Okay, so that's a good idea if that's helpful for you. Now then you can see everything underneath it is indented. It's telling us it's modifying it. So here we can see you were as one of them, and then Obadiah describes basically when this took place. When were you as one of them? And the them here is the foreigners and strangers. Okay. When were you as one of them? And then he gives four descriptions or four examples from a particular day. So he's describing here something happened. And he says here, on the day you stood aloof, on the day strangers. So he gives these four examples. James, did you have a question or comment? I thought I heard you a moment ago. No? Okay. So you understand what Brilio suggested? If we move the independent clause to the beginning, then you can see maybe the diagram a little easier. It's not as confusing. What I have done too, if I have something like this where I have the modifiers before the word it modifies, that's when I sometimes I'll put in an arrow or something just to tell me that. So I might do that. That's another option. That's how I do it. Okay, so either of those approaches is acceptable. As long as you don't leave any words out, and as long as you're putting them, in the right place as far as what word they modify. All right, any questions on verses 10 and 11? I'll have these in your notes. You'll have this so you can kind of look at more detail there, but okay, questions, comments? Cries of pain and agony? Right, and then verse 12 is a little bit more direct, straightforward, I think. All right, because he gives the independent clause first, and then the modifiers. So he says, "Do not gloat." When? Over your brother's day. Which day? The day of his misfortune. So he's that's describing day. So do not gloat over your brother's day modifies do not gloat. It's describing when do not gloat. And then the day of his misfortune. That's the next phrase that modifies day. It's describing which day. Now you could put the day like this if you wanted. But what I typically do is I'll just put, when I have I just put it with on the same line. And so he's going to give a second command, a second independent clause in verse 12. Do not rejoice over the sons of Judah in the day of their destruction. So this was a little harder. I put why do not rejoice. I'm not sure about that, but in the day I know is when. So still in when do not rejoice. Which day? The day of their destruction. And then he gives a third command. Do not boast when in the day, which day of their distress. So verse 12 is a little more straightforward, I think, because he doesn't change up the order like he did in verses 10 and 11. Okay, I'm going to put these back to follow the order of the passage. Okay. So this is the diagram for all 3 verses here. Okay. Comments about that or questions? All right. Yeah, these are definitely more challenging, which, you know, that's the nature of the prophetic genre as well. It's even the diagramming can be a little more challenging because it's more of a poetic style. There may be emphasis and things like that. So the word ordering and all of that may get rearranged because of the author wanting to give emphasis and emotion, right? So his focus is on what the Edomites did, and so he brings the reason up front in verse 10, and then he's focusing attention on the when they actually did these particular things. So he's emphasizing on the day. So he brings that forward as well. All right, had enough of this? Okay. Again, you can look through in the notes for more detail. I'll put the notes that I send out to you. What I wanted to do was, oh, and then I just added, I added verses 13, 14 here, just so you could see sort of the whole paragraph. Notice he just continues with these commands. Do not enter. Do not gloat. Do not loot. Do not stand. Do not imprison. You see a pattern here? So that's verses 12 to 14. These repeated commands that he gives. Okay. All right. Let's see what time we got. All right. Let's turn our attention to another part of this assignment 4.13. It not only is a diagram, but you're going to make the textual observations, which again, this is a step we've done for the previous genres. Nothing new here. And if you'll remember, textual observation just means there's certain features, either grammatical or other particular specific observations that you're being asked to look at in terms of how the passage is structured. So for example, the biggest one is looking at the verbs. Okay, in fact, we already did a little bit of that here when we were talking about the diagram. Okay, and who can tell me, remember with the verbs, so as you go, what you want to do here is you go through the passage and identify all the verbs and then note the 3 main characteristics of each verb. Who can tell me what those 3 characteristics are, or at least one of the 3 characteristics? Anybody? What is a verb in English made up of? What are its 3
Present
attributes?
tense, past tense,
Okay, what's
and
that
future
called?
tense.
Okay, that's called the tense, right? Verbs
Yeah.
have a tense.
The moods.
Okay, good. And it also has, there's the mood of a verb. What are some moods of the verb?
Indicative, imperative.
Very good. There's 2 more. Anybody remember?
Interrogative.
Good. Interrogative.
Subjunctive.
Yeah. The subjunctive. Okay. Right. Indicative makes a statement. Imperative is a command. Interrogative as a question. Subjunctive suggests some doubt or probability of an action. And then finally, oops, what's the third characteristic?
The voice.
Voice. Very good. What are the voices? Active, passive.
Passive.
Okay. And remember, for active is the subject. The active voice means the subject does the action. The passive voice means the action is done to the subject. Okay? Right? So he hit the ball. The subject is he. The verb hit is the action the subject's doing. But if the sentence was the ball was hit, here, oops, the subject is ball in the second sentence, and the action's happening to the ball. That's why it's called passive. You know, right? Like the word passive sort of means just, not taking action, just letting something happen, right? If you're accused of being passive, then that means you don't take action. You're not doing something. You just let things happen to you. Well, that's the same idea of a passive verb. It just means that the subject's not doing anything. Something's being done to the subject.
That's what Obadiah said. You stood aloof.
Yeah. You did nothing. Yeah. You didn't help. The idea there. So, yeah, so for a passive voice, that's just the subject, the action's done to the subject. Active voice means the subject is doing the action. Now, for remember, we have those two kinds of verbs that we have to remember, right? We have verbs of action and verbs of being. Remember that? Verbs of being, it describes the state or condition, right? We saw one just a minute ago, were, right? Or am, was, are, okay? Be, these are all verbs of being. They're describing a state, whereas a verb of action, right, describes an action taking place, okay? Like hit, read, preach, look, right? Cook, all these. That was for Kazo. Verb of action, cooking. To cook. So for a verb of these are the two kinds of verbs, and then each verb has these three characteristics: tense, mood, and voice. Okay. So if we want to look at, let's just do that for our passage here. We'll just look at verses 10 to 12. Okay. We've got the passage on the right here. So let me have James, I'll start with you. Let's just look at verse 10. James, tell me what verbs you see in verse 10 from our passage. Verse 10. Okay, what are the verbs? I'm just looking at verbs.
You?
Okay, you is remember, that's a pronoun, so that's a noun. Okay, remember, verb is describing an action or a state of being. So what are there any actions or state of being here?
Violence.
Okay, violence was that's a noun. Okay, that's
Yeah.
violence is a thing.
Covered.
Yeah, covered. It actually will be covered. All right.
Covered.
So as we look at will be covered, we first want to ask, okay, what is the tense? Past, present, or future, James?
This is
You will be covered. Is that future? Yep. All right. Notice the will. Whenever you see the word will, I will call you. She will go to dinner. Those are that will tells you it's future. All right. What kind of mood is it? Is this a command? Is it a statement? Is it a question?
statement.
Yeah. So what mood is it?
Mood. Mood. Indicative.
Yeah.
Or
Good. All right. And then the voice. So is the subject doing the action, or is the action being done to the subject? Is the subject is you here, right? So is the subject covering, or will the subject be covered?
covered.
Yeah, is that passive or active?
You will be covered. Active.
Okay. Again, ask yourself, is the subject doing the action? Is the subject covering? Or is the action happening to the subject?
This is active assertive.
Okay, notice here, you will be covered. He didn't say you will cover. Okay. Yeah. If it had said you will cover, that's active, but it says you will be covered. So that's passive, right? Yeah.
Naman sutan gulay, ngay gulay.
Okay.
Oo, sa man.
All right. And then what is there another verb in verse 10? Do you see another verb?
Verb. You will be cut off.
Yeah. Will be cut off. All right. And what's the tense? Past, present, or future?
That would be future.
Yep. Because notice the word will be cut off. What's the mood? Statement, a command, question?
This is indicative.
Very good. It's a statement. And then active or passive?
And you will be passive.
Yes. Very good. Because again, the action's happening to the subject. You will be cut off. He didn't say you will cut off, right? He didn't say you will cut off. That it would be active. He said you will be cut off. All right. Okay, good. I know it's been a while since we've done this, so I know you may have to not remember everything, but that's why we're doing it. I wanted to have us practice this. Okay, I'm going to ask Brillo. I want you to take a look at verse 11. Tell me what verbs you see.
Verb, sir.
Yeah, in verse 11.
Stood.
Okay, good. Stood. All right. What is the tense? Past, present, or future?
Past tense, sir. Past tense.
Yeah. Stand would be present tense. Stood is past tense. Is this a command, an instruction, or a statement, or a command, or a question?
A statement, sir. Indicative.
Indicative. Yep. And then active or passive?
It is a
Again, the subject is you. So is the subject doing the action? You stood.
I think, sir, active. Nga.
Yes, you're right. Because he's the subject, you is doing the action. You stood. All right. Okay. Next verb.
Carried, sir.
Let's do this. I'm going to highlight the verbs here. Okay. Sorry, what's the next verb?
Carried, sir.
Yeah, carried, or really carried off is the full
Carried
verb
off.
there. Okay. Carried off. What is the tense?
Past tense.
Yep. What is the mood?
Indicative.
Yes, it's a statement. And then what is the voice?
I think active. Active.
Yep, same thing. Because the strangers, that's the subject, and they're doing the action. Okay. Now, if it had said the strangers were carried off, okay, now the action is being done to the subject. That would be passive. But it doesn't say that. It says the strangers carried off as well. That's active. All right. Any other verbs?
Entered.
Entered. Yep. And all right, the tense, the mood, and the voice. What are they?
Past tense, indicative, and active.
Yep. It's the same. See a pattern here?
Same.
Okay, what's the next verb?
Cast, sir.
All right.
Same, sir. Past,
Same.
indicative, and active.
Yeah.
Then last, where.
And then the last one is a verb of being, were.
Yes. The past tense.
Yeah, and it's the same. It's indicative, active. All right. Good. Very good. All right. Kazot, I'm going to have you do verse 12.
Gloat.
Okay, gloat. And what kind of a verb is it? What's the tense, the mood, the voice?
I think, excuse me, sir.
Present.
Oh, yeah, Brio, you have a question?
The word do is included in the verb.
Yeah, you're right. Technically, it's do gloat.
Do gloat.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, Kazot, what are the three characteristics?
Present.
Okay, it's present. Good. What mood?
Imperative.
Yeah, it's a command, isn't it? Active or passive?
Active.
Yeah, you do not gloat. So
You.
the subject's being commanded. All right, what's the next verb?
Do rejoice.
Yes, do rejoice.
Present.
Okay, present tense,
Imperative.
imperative, it's command, and
Active.
yeah. All right, and then any more?
Do boast.
And it's the same, right?
Same.
So you see a pattern here, guys, by the way, verse 10, the verbs were both the same, future indicative passive. Verse 11, all the verbs were past indicative active. Verse 12, they're all present imperative active. So there is a pattern here. And that pattern helped us when we noticed it, it helped us with the diagram. Remember, if we go back, when we trying to figure out like where, where does on the day go? And we noticed that, well, wait, all of these verbs are past tense. It made more sense that it would be modifying this past tense verb, not a future tense verb. Okay. Okay. Well, don't really kind of ran out of time here. Another feature that we want to look for in textual observations is the pronouns. Okay. Remember, there's 3 kinds: first person, second person, and third person pronouns. Okay, so you just want to note what pronouns do you see in the passage and what do they refer to. So for example, in verse 10, because of violence to your, that's a pronoun, brother Jacob. Who's the your? Well, if we go back in the passage, it's referring to Edom, right? You, again, referring to Edom, will be covered with shame, and you will be cut off forever. Verse 11, the day that you, still referring to Edom, stood aloof, on the day that strangers were carried off his wealth, his, who does the his refer to? Jacob. Okay. So his goes back to Jacob. And foreigners entered his, again, Jacob. You were as one of them. Okay. Them is also a pronoun. What does the them refer to? Anybody?
The enemies.
Yeah. The foreigners in this
The
passage.
foreigners. Oh.
Okay, or strangers, right? That's the, okay. So in this step, you just identify the pronouns and then say where what they refer to. All right. And then next you would look for the conjunctions. Okay, we have and. We have and. Oh, because of. And in verse 12. Okay. So that's simply just identifying those conjunctions, which we really have already done in the diagram, but this step we just want to make sure we take note of them. Look for any contrasts, look for any lists. Now here we don't really see a list, but if we were to include verses 13 and 14, right? We would see actually a list there of commands. Okay, verse 12, right? Notice all the commands. Do not gloat, do not rejoice, do not boast, do not enter, do not gloat, do not loot, do not stand, do not, you see that? So that would be a list of commands in this case. A lot of them, by the way. Okay. So you just want to note any lists in the passage that you see, and then purpose result statements, conditional clauses. Do we see any if then here? And then the tone of the passage. Okay. Again, these are the things. This isn't a new step at all. This is what we've done before for epistles, for narratives, for poetry. So we're just doing, again, this is another step. It's just forcing us to look at the passage, looking for certain things, so we're looking at the text from a different perspective. We've done the diagram. So we've tried to understand how the structure of the passage, where the phrases and clauses fit, what they modify. Then we go back and now, okay, we make specific observations of the verbs, the pronouns, any lists, any purpose statements, conjunctions. Again, this is a step that by itself may not seem that important, but when you do it with all of the other steps, it's just another way of having us look at the passage. And sometimes then things may pop out that you didn't really notice before. Okay, it's just like taking something and looking at it from a different angle, from a different point of view. You might see something you didn't notice before. Okay, it's like if you were going to go buy a motorcycle, and if you just looked at the picture that the person posted that's selling it, well, you don't know what's on the other side, do you? Until you go look at it and say, hey, wait a minute, what's that big dent there? So it's the same with a passage. You don't want to just look at it from one side. You don't want to just do one kind of analysis, because then that'll only show you maybe only a few things. But if you look at the passage doing different kinds of analysis, you may see other things that you wouldn't have noticed, just like looking at the other side of the bicycle, looking underneath it, looking in the engine, right? Carefully examining the seat and the top. So that's, you're looking at the motorcycle from different angles to show you perhaps different things that you wouldn't see from just one viewpoint. Okay, so that's what this step is intended to do. And then the last part of this assignment is the word studies, which again we've done before, and I put the format, the directions in your assignment as an example, so you can review that. Just identify what you think are important words in your passage, like in Brilio's text, you know, the apple of his eye. That would be a good word to look up in the Hebrew and see what does that word actually mean, the Hebrew word. Okay, so the whole procedure is in the notes as an example. We've done it before, so it's nothing new. It's just identify words in your passage that seem important, or that maybe don't make sense to you, or that are repeated, or key actions in your passage, and look that word up, the original word in the Hebrew, and then other passages that it's in, etc. Okay. All right. Well, I know this part of the process, this step in the process, it's a lot of nosebleed grammar. I understand that may not be as fun or interesting, but it is, like I said, an important part, because when you do all these steps together, like I said, it's just like looking at that motorcycle from other viewpoints. You will see things you would not have noticed, and sometimes you might find something very important by looking at the text from one particular point of view. So these steps all together will contribute to helping us better understand the passage, even though some of the steps may not be, may be more tedious or difficult or complicated than some of the others. All right, well, thank you for your endurance, your patience for this session. I know that's this is always the challenging part when we get to the diagramming and the observations. But it's already noon, so I know you probably want to have your lunch. But any final thoughts or questions? You've had enough. Okay. Again, just encouragement to make sure you enroll for the semester. An encouragement to press forward on your assignments. I sent you a few days ago, just gave you an update of where each of you are at as far as the assignments you have for modules 1 to 4. So again, that wasn't trying to make you feel bad at all, but just so that you can be aware of what I see on Canvas and what's been turned in, and just to let you know kind of what you have in front of you. We are, gathering together, Lord willing, the first week of May. So do your best to get yourself caught up there for that. That module will be preaching your prophetic texts, and then some of you have a sermon maybe from a previous module that I indicated to you that would need to be made up then. So let's do the best you can to get caught up by that time, okay? Okay. Well, again, thank you guys. Appreciate your time. Thank you for your perseverance. Let me ask if James, if you could close us in prayer for today.